Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good to see you all. This is our final Sunday together, studying Paul. And let's see, I already told some folks I don't have any responsibilities at my church today, so I think I'm going to stay for worship. So I'm looking forward to that. Today's going to be maybe a little bit scattershot. We're going to try to cover a number of big questions in Paul. Not all of them by any means, but some of them. At least some of the aspects of Paul that have been more difficult for Protestant Christians as they relate to Jewish and Christian relations, and then also feminism studies, treatment of women and views of women, and let's see. Well, and this feeds into some of the books that have been used to support patriarchal and hierarchical structures in church. We'll get into more of kind of, maybe readjusting how we view those books that are purportedly written by Paul, but probably not. So we'll move through all of this. Raise your hand or shout out my name, Joel, right? If you've got a question. We can always pause and do that. And then we'll see if we have time for general questions. I usually try to pause and allow that. But
Thank you so much.
Okay, so as we go through, always bear in mind, right, Paul's Jewish context and the Roman context. Okay, so Paul is a Jew. He's one Jewish man who's thinking about how to be true to God's commandments, how to live life as a good Jew in the context of imperial Rome, right? An empire that has allowed Jews to live and practice, but somewhat as second-class citizens. And so thinking about how to navigate the social dynamics of that, social and political dynamics. Always keep in mind, Paul, we're removed by 2,000 years from this guy. Different culture, different time. We think about things a certain way. Paul thought about them in a completely different way. And if we're honest, it's impossible to, I can't put an ancient person, right here and ask them what they think about this or that. We're always trying to make draw conclusions as best we can from the evidence we have. And finally, I want to say that, especially when we get into talking about Paul and women, I don't think we don't need to defend Paul as a feminist by any means. We're going to read today a view on Paul that's going to challenge some of the traditional readings of Paul, but that by no means means that Paul was like the first feminist. Okay, Paul is thoroughly embedded in his world. I think there are nuanced ways we can understand his views on women today, and I'm grateful for the feminist scholars which inform what we're going to be talking about today. So the goal is to, is always try to be as comprehensive in our reading as Paul as we can at any given point. Not to try to read one single verse and then say, well, that's what Paul thought about this or that. Because, as we pointed out, Paul seems to be trying to figure things out on the go as he encounters different problems in different communities. So, taking any singular verse and trying to draw out an entire philosophy or theology from that is not a good way to read. Not a good way to read Paul or read the Bible, I would argue. So we'll start off by noting, we're going to start off with a great conversation. We'll start off by noting a few things about this conversation. Circumcision was not a practice that was exclusive to ancient Israelites. We often think about that, but we have ample evidence going back 3,000 years to suggest that other ancient Near Eastern peoples practiced circumcision. So this is not exclusive to ancient Israel, and perhaps not even exclusive to Jews, although it eventually becomes a central religious practice in Judaism. We need to remember that. Circumcision actually is important during Paul's time because it is a physical mark of identification in the Greek city. Why? Why? We think about circumcision and we're like, well, this is a private matter. Put yourself in the Greek polis, in the Greek city. Why does circumcision matter, do you think? Does every house have indoor plumbing?
No.
Okay, so where do you go to take a bath? Where do you use public restrooms? In a river. Maybe in a river. No, there's public baths, right? The Romans, the Greeks are known for their public baths. So circumcision is a mark that it would identify you as a particular kind of person. So keep that context in mind, that this is something, this isn't just some esoteric conversation that Paul is having. This really matters for people who exist in a Greek city. So then the other thing to keep in mind is that Paul's discussion about circumcision are not incidental, but central to his broader conception of Gentile inclusion into Abraham's family. What we might say, salvation. In the Greco-Roman world, there were actually a number of non-Jewish folks, usually in the somewhat elite echelons of society, who found the Jewish way of life attractive. You had this shift from thinking about the Greek polis as the health and virtue of a city to, when you destroy community, okay, when the Greek city is kind of overrun by Roman imperialism, the shift goes from community to individual. And you have all of the individual philosophies of Paul's day, at least, right? You have Stoicism, Epicureanism, Peripatetics, and you have lots of individual philosophers. And you can subscribe to a way of life that makes sense for you and how to live a virtuous life. And Judaism had an attraction for a number of people with its dietary restrictions, laws around sexuality, and those sorts of things. There are other things that are attractive about Jewish law, which might interest us even today. Very plainly in the text, in the Torah, it talks about no interest being levied on loans. It talks about debts being canceled every 7 years. There are prohibitions against harvesting all crops for profit, right? These are things that could be beneficial for any society. Jewish law was viewed as a way for Israel to be holy as God is holy, as a way to overcome sin and vice and live virtuously, and as a way to care for the poor in society. Once you have Gentiles who become introduced to Judaism, who start to enter Jewish spaces and adopt patterns of Jewish living, what happens? Well, circumcision becomes an important question in that. And for the early followers of Jesus, there are competing conceptions on, well, if I'm going to join this movement and I'm an adult male, do I have to become circumcised to be part of this group? We'll find out that Paul says, no, do not hurt yourself this way. Like, literally, don't hurt yourself this way. So the traditional interpretation of circumcision in Paul minimizes this important religious practice and identity marker, right? All ritual practices, whether we're talking about religious practices or secular, okay? A ritual, something that forms identity, that orders your life, gives meaning to something. They all have significance beyond the mere act itself, right? Communion. When you participate in Holy Communion, you're not just taking a piece of bread and a cup of, do you guys do wine or grape juice?
Grape juice.
And a cup of juice. It's more than that, okay? There's a lot of symbolism and implications wrapped up in that ritual. Christian theologians and thinkers have reduced this act of circumcision to a mere physical rite. And in that way, that's a disservice to honoring another religious tradition. It flattens it, it dismisses it. So not only is that reading historically inaccurate, kind of that Lutheran, this is a mere physical rite, it means nothing, it has no implications for salvation, Not only is that historically inaccurate of Paul, but it also contributes to anti-Jewish supersessionist theology, right? Christianity and Christians have supplanted Jews as the chosen people of God. Now, there are plenty of examples in the scripture. If you're willing to isolate a single verse or a little sentence here and there, that could be used as evidence to say, well, yeah, Paul was dismissive of circumcision. For example, you could read this little bit in Philippians 3:2. Beware of the mutilation. Again, remember, and Paul is here, he's literally talking about mutilating your body as an adult man undergoing circumcision. Beware of the mutilation. Well, that means Paul is totally, he didn't think that circumcision meant anything. You could read in Romans 2:28-29, and I think this is my translation. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not the written code. Such a person receives praise not from humans, but from God. Okay, let's pause there.
Yeah.
Let's pause there. So, I put true in brackets because I think if you consult, now this is the NRSV right here, Romans 2:28. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true. Okay, yeah. A lot of English translation add this word true circumcision. There's no Greek equivalent of that word in the Greek text. I think this is just a gross overstep by translators to say that this is true circumcision, and to equate that with circumcision as a matter of the heart, which we might interpret as saying, well, circumcision is, don't focus on the physical act. It's a spiritual matter. The thing here is, yeah, Paul is saying circumcision is a matter of the heart, but he's not the first Jew to say that. You can find places in the Old Testament, for example, in Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and also Jeremiah, where it talks about circumcision as a matter of the heart. It's not circumcision as a physical act versus circumcision as a matter of the heart. It has always been both and. There's the physical act of circumcision, which God commanded Abraham, right? And then it passed on from there. But there have been prophets and writers and thinkers in ancient Israel and then on into Paul's period who were bringing in this other discussion of it being a matter of the heart. And there's got to be some, I'm thinking out loud here, with the way Jesus interprets the law and kind of goes from, the reading on the page into more of like, there's a spiritual dimension to the law. So Paul is doing something very familiar here, something he's in line with Jewish tradition. There's nothing unusual here. So to read this as Paul, the convert to Christianity, who's rejecting Judaism and the practices of Judaism, is not the correct reading here. And I don't say that lightly, because to say there's a correct reading, it's hard to make a claim that you have the correct reading. I think it's a better reading that's more in line with the historical evidence to say that this is a both and situation.
But
Yes,
wasn't the practice with the Jewish people like on the 12th day or something?
the eighth day.
8th day.
Yeah, we'll see that in a little bit.
Doing that to a baby, the baby has no choice. It's not a matter of their heart.
Well, do you
The
baptize infants here?
Yeah.
Was it their choice? This is a critique I've always gotten. I was baptized at 9. I was raised in a tradition with believer's baptism, right? I'm Lutheran now. Both my children have been baptized as infants, and this is the criticism that I've got from people in the in the believer's baptism think, well, you're not giving the infant a choice. Well, do you let your infant choose other things in life?
They get their vaccinations with not a choice.
Yeah. So there's a lot of writing out there on the what do we say? It's truncation of childhood. I don't know if that's a word. The shrinking of childhood, when you start to give children, to put the onus of decision making on children, and we've started to do that at a younger and younger and younger age, and what that does theoretically to childhood. Sorry, that's off the point. Say again, is there a criticism here or a question about?
Well, when it says that it's basically a physical right, but rather a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit, not the written code.
Right.
So if I read that, I would say circumcision happens as an adult.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think? Okay, but we also as Christians, we remember our baptism. Now, I actually can remember my baptism because I was baptized at 9.
I was 25.
Okay, so some of us can, but if you were baptized as an infant, like you can't remember your baptism. You need the community who witnessed it and who upholds it and honors it to help remember it and to remember the significance. You're baptized into a community. As an infant, we don't know the significance of that, but as you grow, it can become a matter of the heart by the Spirit, right? That baptism is the foundation of how we ground our faith and live into our communal identity with other people as Christians. Does that make, so I agree with you. I think there is the physical, right? There's the physical act, but then there's this growth as you go along as one who is part of a community, where you realize over time the significance of that ritual.
We call it confirmation, as you know.
Yes, confirmation. Excellent. Now, readers of a traditional view, right? You could go through Romans, that first little part there. Well, Paul seems to be, the physical act doesn't matter. It's all about true circumcision. Matter of the heart, which true circumcision, again, your English translators have primed you to think that Paul is stepping out beyond the physical act. But then Paul, like a master, he does this regularly. Then he goes right into Romans 3 and he asks this question. He asks the question that's on all of our minds. Well, then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. He says it right there. Now, we'll probably skip over that little bit. Much in every way. He says it right there. That if you're Jewish, circumcision still matters. He is a circumcised Jew. It still matters for him. You can be a circumcised Jew and also follow Jesus. That's Paul's argument. But Paul would say that circumcision does not get a Gentile into Abraham's family. It only causes harm, literal harm, to a Gentile. Okay? It's okay to be a circumcised Jew. You can follow Jesus as a circumcised Jew. It's okay to be an uncircumcised Gentile. You can follow Jesus as an uncircumcised Gentile. It's not either or one better than the other.
Okay, just
Yeah.
quick.
Sure.
So if a Gentile becomes circumcised or is circumcised, how does anybody tell? Tries to pass.
Tries to
Pass as a Jew.
Oh, pass it. Oh, people probably did.
Yeah.
People probably did. And there were people in Paul's own ministry who, Paul seems to be arguing all the time against other people who follow, other Jews who have followed Jesus, who are saying, yes, you need to do this to become saved or to join this movement. Paul is almost always arguing against people who have different ideas than him, different interpretations of the early Jesus movement. So, there were definitely Gentiles who underwent circumcision as an adult. This clearly happened. Just by Paul saying, beware of the mutilation, he's already referencing something that's happening. And he's saying, this is unfortunate, this is an incorrect interpretation. But I don't know, are we like are we the third party outside who then basically makes the judgment and says, well, this was the wrong way, this was the right way?
But that interpretation then sort of does bring about the idea that Paul is saying that following Jesus, you're not part of the Jewish community. When we started,
Oh, I
I
see.
think you were talking about the different layers of, or the different sort of directions under the umbrella of Judaism, and that Christ followers was there
Yeah,
in Paul's time.
I think you're getting at the sticking point in all of the ongoing debates about where do we draw the line between Judaism and a clean break of Christianity from Judaism, which most scholars are going to say we can't identify that. It seems to have been a process that is hard to retrace, but this might be part of that discussion. This is difficult. Paul is pioneering, let's say that, pioneering a different kind of Judaism, one that doesn't require all of its members to be circumcised, and one that, whereas the entry point of being a Jew was as an infant, circumcision as an infant, which also, the elephant in the room here is, we're talking about men exclusively, and we're not talking about women.
I understand that.
But Paul is saying, no, you can become a part of this. Now I'm overlaying our interpretation. You can become a part of this Jewish movement. You can become a part of God's family, of Abraham's family, without having to undergo this rite. That's not a clean answer, but there's no settled answer on drawing these hard and fast distinctions between Judaism and Christianity. Paul goes in, we had a question earlier, and you had mentioned, what day are Jews circumcised? And Paul has a lengthier discussion in Galatians about this, where he talks about Abraham's 2 sons. How many other sons did Abraham have? Does anyone know? Pop quiz. He had 6 other sons. They never get mentioned. They get no story time in the text. But Abraham had 6 other sons. We only talk about Ishmael and Isaac. So Paul reflects on this situation. He basically says, okay, Ishmael was probably circumcised at age 13. And Isaac, the son of promise, right, was circumcised on the 8th day, according to what God had commanded. So his argument is that any adult male who undergoes circumcision is imitating Ishmael in this case, and therefore will share the same fate as Ishmael by not inheriting the promise and becoming a child of the covenant. It's only those who are born of the Spirit, according to Paul, who will inherit the promise and become part of Abraham's family. So it's just a lengthier discussion on why adult males do not need to be circumcised, and secondly, why then being born of the Spirit is not exclusive to men. This is anyone who joins this movement. You have to be reborn of the Spirit. And I put the Greek word pneuma there because a lot of people thinking about this now are trying to, when we think of Spirit, we immediately think of the Trinity and the Holy Spirit. There's a lot of baggage there, right? I don't want to say baggage. There's a lot of Christian theology behind the Holy Spirit that Paul wouldn't have there. What does Paul mean by pneuma? Some people have argued that Paul thinks of the pneuma the way the Stoics would during this time, as an actual substance. An actual substance. And if you think that as Christians, you are born of the pneuma, then you have this substance that is of God within you. And therefore, when Paul's making an argument that you are the body of Christ, when, Christ is no longer physically here. Well, Christ is physically here if you believe that the pneuma is a real substance, as Paul probably did during this time. So the implications, thinking about like the church as the body, the literal body of Christ, I think there's probably a lot of work that's been done on that recently, honestly. Okay, circumcision. Any other questions before we get into this fun stuff? Yes?
What role does baptism then play in this spirit and becoming born of? And
Yeah, so baptism is the physical rite, the ritual, right? The ritual that underlies that being born of the Spirit. And even baptism, right? I think there are multiple ways of viewing baptism, even in the New Testament. If you were to choose to focus on this text or that text, a gospel text or a text in Paul, there are different ways of viewing it. Baptism also, as we think about it as a Christian practice, like the origins of baptism are really hard to identify. I think when you brought up the Didache this morning, like the Didache talks about baptism. That's an early 2nd century document. I think at that time you can start to talk about Christian baptism. But in the 1st century when Paul is working, I mean, it's hard to say, is there a distinct Christian, can you identify a distinct Christian practice of baptism in the 1st century? Maybe very late in the 1st century, but certainly not during Paul's time.
so when is this being born of the Spirit?
We'll have to do a further study of Galatians to do this. Come on now, did you? Galatians 3-4. Now you see, this is meant to give you, this talk is not meant to be super specific on a whole lot of things. These are good questions. I'm not going to be able to give you answers on it. And I don't want to slow us down too much. Being born of the Spirit is something that Paul talks about quite often. Now the act that brings that about, you'll have to read further.
But Joel, he does talk about baptism in Galatians 3, right? That's the whole point. As many of you are baptized into Christ, clothe yourselves.
Yes, okay.
So that's the
Good.
classic Reformation read, is that
Yeah.
baptism is the new covenant marker of inclusion in the people of God, thus including women for the very first time.
Yes.
In that marker, specifically.
Yeah, and so, and that the word baptism there, from the Greek term, then I would still maintain, like, what is, because being washed or cleansing oneself has a long history in Judaism too. So trying to distinguish them, like, there's something important about the act of ritually washing oneself, which I think Paul is participating in that tradition. He just doesn't explicitly talk about, like, how this happens. The Didache that you're writing about has to happen in cold running water. It's very specific, right, about what baptism looks like. But no, this is good, thank you. All right, women in Paul's letters. All right, 1 Corinthians is kind of the starting place for this discussion. In 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16, you get this doozy in verse 5. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered disgraces her head. So, what does Paul mean by this? Paul uses the term for covering the head, but never uses the Greek term for veil. So it's hard to say, like, Paul is not talking about putting a veil over your head or anything like that. He's talking about covering your head. Is this hair? Long hair? Is it, what does this mean? What we do need to note, because we skip over this, and the folks who use these kinds of passages to deny women a place of leadership, it is assumed here that women do pray and prophesy in front of the assembly. Paul assumes that right here. there's no question as to whether or not they're allowed to. They do it. He's just saying that every woman who does this with her head uncovered disgraces herself, which is pretty harsh language.
But the men would have had their heads covered.
Yeah, presumably.
Could you say it again? I didn't.
But the men would have had their heads.
Yeah, men would have had their heads covered as well.
Well, in the Catholic Church, which I've never been Catholic, but when we were in Venice and you had to cover your head or you couldn't even go in to look as a tourist
Oh,
in the cathedral, you had to wear a headscarf over. And they, what we were told by one of their docents or something, that they required you to cover your hair because your hair would be your beauty.
Okay.
And you covered it so that people weren't looking at your beauty, they were focusing on Christ.
Yeah, these are interesting.
So I found a head scarf.
Yeah, well, this is, if you go to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, or the Wailing Wall, some people call it, I mean, you have to put a yarmulke or a kippah on your head to go approach the wall, if you're a man. And women, of course, have to cover their heads also on a separate side. You can't go with men on one side, women on the other. Why? Okay, so why is this? Because of this, a woman should have authority over her head. As feminist scholars have all pointed out, what does this even mean? It's hard to, and this is the point with Paul. We want to nail down what Paul means on everything, especially in discussions of human sexuality, right? What does Paul mean about this or that? Like, he uses turns of phrases and words and sentences that just are hard to understand. Even when you look outside of his writing, if you look at other Greek writing from the time, it's just impossible to know what exactly Paul is talking about. And this is one of those. What does Paul mean for a woman to have authority over her head? Though some folks might be quick to jump to like, well, it's the man's authority over her head. Okay, but he doesn't say that in this passage. That's not the point here. So, was there a question? Yes.
Could he be trying to say with that authority, a woman has authority over her head, that really it's her choice? Because, even today in the conservative Jewish synagogue, men and women, you have to have something over your head. I had to buy a bread cap when I was with bread. Everyone did to go into the synagogue. So if he's saying, women, when you come into the synagogue, you'd have something on your head or you're not doing it right.
Yeah.
Then he says, but you have authority over your head. So you have a choice.
Okay, so you're getting,
It's
yeah,
a pro-choice statement.
you're on to something important here. So just hold on a second. So this passage has been studied by Carla Swafford Works, who's at, she's at Wesley Theological Seminary, New Testament scholar. She looked at this passage, and here's what she talks about. So veils are worn as a marker of status and decency in Roman society. Okay, to be a freeborn citizen wife in Roman society was the highest honor for a woman. Okay, again, we are operating in a different social framework at this time. So we need to understand the rules of the game to understand what Paul is writing, okay? Let's try to withhold our judgments of like, well, this was terrible. Let's try to just withhold the judgments for a second while we try to understand this context. In contrast, women who worked as prostitutes, women considered as adulteresses, lower class women, slaves, were not permitted to wear veils in public. Okay? Understand the system. If you're a woman of the highest honor, you wear a veil in public. If you are not, you do not wear a veil in public. A bare head for a woman communicated sexual availability in Roman society, which opens women up to all kinds of sexual abuse and assault. A veil protected a woman theoretically. Let's not pretend that sexual assault still didn't happen just because you wore a veil. But a veil protected a woman from objectification. So, and I quote Professor Swafford Works here. Paul's advice here for all women to pray and prophesy with a covering would be countercultural. it would grant status to women who outside the church could never hope to be treated with the respect granted a Roman wife. So this community, in which men and women freely volunteer to associate themselves with, enter into this community as equals. And this would be in keeping with Galatians 3:28, right? There is no longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer male and female. Okay? That's Paul's writing, and this would fit into this as a more egalitarian ordered community. All right? So, at least, this doesn't solve the authority over the head thing, I don't think, but it does solve why Paul would say, well, if you're a woman who's not allowed to wear a veil out in society, but you come in here, of course you're allowed to pray and prophesy in front of the community, but put a veil on, because we are all of equal status here. Questions about this? Oh, yeah, if you want to, this larger article this larger essay, Women in the Pauline Mission, it's a good essay to read in general. She deals with other passages as well. Also, those who are in traditions that deny women authority in leadership positions fail to account for all of the women that Paul talks about in his ministry. You have, Romans 16 is the place where, Paul names a lot of people who are his associates. You have Phoebe, who's listed as a deacon and benefactor. Benefactor would mean this is someone who has wealth and means and uses it to benefit others. In a context where benefactors are usually like wealthy Romans who sometimes give of their treasure to build a statue to make the city look better or something like that. You have Prisca, or I think in Acts, Priscilla is the other name you come across. This is presumably the same person. You have Prisca, who's listed as a co-worker, as a church planter, as a teacher, as a fellow prisoner with Paul. You have Eunia, who's a missionary apostle. Now, does anyone know the debate about Eunia, or Junia as we might say? We have early manuscripts of scribes who changed this name Eunia to Eunios, which is the masculine. So even in the early transmission of the text, you have scribes who are like, oh, this couldn't have been Eunia. Paul's, basically co-equal missionary apostle. This was Eunios. You have Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Persis, he mentions them, who, quote, work hard in the Lord. You have the mother of Rufus, who models mothering care for others. So Paul just has this whole list of people, of women, men and women, but notably of women who are playing important parts, important roles in this early movement. And you don't even have to just stop there at the text, at the New Testament text itself. Go to some of the early church fathers. John Chrysostom writes on Eunia, "Oh, how great is the devotion of this woman that she should be counted worthy of the appellation of apostle." This is late 2nd, early 3rd? I'm getting that right? 3rd century? Yeah. This is hundreds of years after Paul, where you still have a recognition that these women serve important roles, that they deserve the appellation of apostle. Origen, writing probably early 3rd century. This was 5th. Chrysostom is late 4th, early 5th. This passage teaches, writing on Romans, this passage teaches that there were women ordained in the church's ministry by the apostles' authority. Not only that, they ought to be ordained into the ministry because they helped in many ways, and by their good services deserved the praise even of the apostle. what happened to our tradition? I mean, how do you get to where we are today, where you have a pretty strong faction of Christianity that denies ordination to women, or says women can only teach in Sunday school if their husbands are present, or something like that. My sister left a church that that made her do that when she got married.
That's still the majority position.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like strong majority.
Yeah.
We're still the minority.
It's incredible to think about. All right, so there's women in Paul's letters. Let's okay, here's all I'm gonna say about the pastoral epistles. There's 3 slides worth of this, but all I want to do is say we want to think about, because these contain some of the detailed passages on I think it's in Timothy. The detailed passages on elders. An elder is supposed to be the husband of one wife. Children are supposed to be like well behaved or something like that. And he gives all these dispositions of a good elder. We shouldn't view these as writings by Paul himself. Why wouldn't we do that? Number one, the themes are very different. You go from kind of those 8 authentic Pauline letters, which is what we've been looking at, okay? Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Thessalonians. You go from these, and you don't get this strong sense of hierarchy in a church. It's very organic. This whole movement is very organic. Paul is trying to figure things out. He's addressing problems as they come up. He clearly writes in a way that hints at this being an egalitarian movement. And then you get to these pastoral epistles. What happened? What happened here? It's the best way to think about this is institutionalization. When you go from Paul, who's writing about the parousia, the near return of Christ that's going to come at any point, when that's kind of the feature that's a big factor in your group, and then Jesus doesn't actually return, and Paul dies, how do you continue this movement? You know, that singular event that you've been waiting for, that you've ordered your entire life and your practices around this second coming of Jesus, and it doesn't happen. What do? Do you let the movement die? Or do you adjust the teaching and theology and put structures in place to perpetuate the movement? And that's the argument would be that these letters are written in Paul's name, probably by Paul's disciples, people who believed in Paul, believed in what he did. But we're getting into a 2nd and 3rd generation of thinking about Paul. And you get kind of this movement from Paul, the man himself, to Paulinism, which is a study of Paul, an idea of trying to emulate his teaching. And in that case, is everything that Paul originally taught, is that preserved exactly as it was? No, because when people ruminate on things and think about things and put it into practice and adjust practices and copy texts and recopy texts and have Sunday school hours like this, and we create this discourse that changes the thing. And so these letters, rather than viewing them as Paul himself, as a man who apparently is conflicted about everything, rather than view it that way, view it as Paul's disciples, schools of Jesus followers who believed in what Paul was doing and wanted to carry on his work. And by this late first, early second century, you get these writings written in Paul's name that, very patriarchal, very hierarchical, and much more organized in terms of the movement. Does that mean we dismiss those writings? Well, no, they were preserved in our Bible. What I would say, and this is what I say with, if you're studying the Gospels, you're studying Paul, you're thinking about Christianity in general. There's no one singular way that was ever the right way. Our scriptures preserve multiple and sometimes competing views on how to be a follower of Jesus. And so I appreciate that diversity. Do I agree with every view? No, I don't. And I think that's okay as modern readers to come in here to grasp the historical context and to understand the dynamics of how you go from Paul and how you go to a movement that has become bigger, more organized, and needs to survive beyond this man, Paul himself. Appreciate the diversity. I think that's a lesson we can appreciate for lots of things. All right, that's it. What questions do you have? This is like every class, even my seminary classes. We're out of time.
I would just make the comment that the thinking of just about that veil and that's like sort of iconoclastic. I mean, it just breaks how I
Well, yeah, because we view the veil as like an imposed symbol of patriarchy or control over women. Like that's how we view put something, cover your head. That's how we view that today. But if we try to step into that historical context in which Paul's operating, that's not the right way to view it. And if you're in the dominant version of Christianity, Catholicism, the new, very conservative Catholicism, J.D. Vance, he's our vice president. He's joined this movement. Head covering it's been recovered. It's been recovered by this movement. So wearing a head covering in the Catholic Mass is.
Well, I hope he does too.
You are what?
Yes, I hope he wears a head covering too.
If you're seeking any sort of consistency in J.D. Vance's views on anything,
Wait till you're
wanting.
Hi, I guess I want to comment, question, where do you think tribalism is in all of this? Because I feel like I'm hearing people want to know who's in and who's out, how do I know, and how far are you willing to go to prove that you're in?
Would we deny that tribalism is just part of the human condition? I think that's, whether we're talking about religion or, look at the way politics is today. You want to belong to your tribe. And I think sometimes that's a good thing, like belonging to a community, as long as that's healthy.
I belong to my tribe, and
Like if you think that this church is a healthy place to be, great, you've associated yourselves with these are people. There's nothing wrong with that. It's harder for more progressive or liberal groups to draw hard and fast boundaries on who's in and who's out, simply because I'll just say we're hesitant to do that. Because it necessarily involves making a judgment, a moral judgment on who's wrong and who's right. I grew up in a conservative religious community. It's a lot easier when you can just say, oh yeah, that person does that, that's bad, they're out. It's just a lot easier to say that instead of, oh, what things are in this person's background, or what are they currently going through that have led to why they do this practice. In my head, I'm thinking about smoking. I grew up in a context where someone smoked, no, it's bad. It's bad.
Right.
And I'm not saying, from a health perspective, okay, yeah, it's bad, but I don't need to make a moral judgment about this person because they smoke or because they have a tattoo. That's the other thing. Yeah.
I don't remember where it was, but I remember hearing about, applied to Paul, that, he thought men shouldn't marry because there was a time, because, Jesus was gonna come.
Okay,
and
okay.
Get busy, and so I think early on, or sometime you said Paul was, is that?
There are scholars who have taken like one single verse and like, well, there's a possibility that Paul was married. That's a minority position in scholarship.
Do you remember where it was said? I mean,
I'd have to look back in my.
I mean, well, at this point, I'm kind of like, oh, right, well, some are known to have been written by Paul, and some of the letters were written by others,
Yeah.
and attributed to Paul, and so I need to look, I need to figure this out. But I thought maybe you would know.
I can tell after class when we're done, I'll pull it. It's in the first week of the lecture. It's a passage from Corinthians. I don't remember the exact location, probably because I don't believe Paul was ever married. He just seems like the kind of guy who he ticked a lot of people off. He moved around a lot. I just can't imagine that he had a wife. Or if he did, that's like in the you'd have to see the prequel series, which we haven't discovered yet of Paul's life. What happened in Paul's life before the actual thing that we have. But yeah, I'll get that for you after. I just have to look at a different PowerPoint. Other questions or comments about Paul?
We made him very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, I found Paul to be more interesting as I put this study together. So. Yeah.
And what are the 8 letters? You said there are.
Oh yeah, the 8 authentic Pauline letters that are accepted as that. Okay, so Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians, Romans, Corinthians, Philippians, Galatians. So yeah, Acts. Yeah, I said Romans. Why am I?
Both Corinthians, but only the 1 Thessalonians.
Only 1 Thessalonians, yeah. Here, let's do this. Let's go to. Let's go to Google, right? That's where all the answers are.
What would we do without the, we use those old botanicals, they were 20 years old, sitting on the shelf.
Yeah. Okay, Galatians, which Google thinks is an early, okay, Galatians was early, but 1 Thessalonians is definitely the earliest. Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians. There's debate on 2 Corinthians. It might contain 2 other correspondencies. So there's some discussion about 3rd and 4th Corinthians, that sort of thing. Oh, Philemon, or you probably say Philemon. Philemon is the other one I was forgetting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Okay.
It said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 as a phone number. Pretty funny, yeah. 7, 5, 3.
Maybe I misspoke. Maybe it is 7. I always had 8 in my head.
You said, did you add Philippians?
Yeah, we had Philippians. Yeah.
Well, this has been very helpful.
Thank you.
So
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Thank you all. It's been fun to be with you. You raised good questions. Next year, if you contact me, you'll have to let me know like what do you want to talk about.
Thank you for being with us.
Yeah.